Um, I've been an activist for many years in Israel. I'm getting in front of bulldozers because I'm the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, fighting the occupation. And over the years, as I've been on the ground, getting kicked by Israeli soldiers and this and that, the question in the back of my mind, kind of nagging me in the back of my mind, was always, how does Israel get away with this? Here we have a conflict. One of the major conflicts in the world disrupts the entire Middle East. It's happening in the southern border of Europe in the light of day. It's not happening in the faraway mountains somewhere. In the Holy Land, no less, just to give it an added twist, supported by the United States and Europe, involving major weapon systems, with a degree of violence, especially over Gaza, for example, and occasional wars, that are major wars really in any context. And Israel is an occupying power of the last 50 years, and yet the Israeli status in the international community gets better and better all the time. Every successive president loves Israel more, gives more money to Israel. Now we're up to $38 billion over a 10-year period for arms from the United States. And internationally, Israel's reputation gets better and better. Just a few years ago, Israel was voted in to the OECD, which is the club of the exclusive advanced economies of the world. At that time, there were 25 members. To become a member, not only did you have to have a certain level of economic development and stability, but you had to adhere to human rights standards and to international law. To get into the OECD, it has to be a unanimous vote among the 25 most advanced economies in the world. And Israel was voted in. With an occupation, with everything else we're talking about, was voted in, even by countries like Norway and Ireland that are otherwise, very critical of Israel. So one question is why? That's one question. Another question is, we have here the map of what we call the two-state solution. That was a solution for many years to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as it's called. And it's obviously a very pro-Israeli solution. And this is the political solution supported by the United States and the international community, in which Israel is on 78% of historic Palestine, even though the Jews today are a minority in this country, and the Palestinians, the indigenous majority population, are confined to, or would have gotten, maybe under this idea, a little state on 22% of their historic homeland. The West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. So in 1988, the PLO under Arafat officially recognized Israel in these borders and said to Israel, we will normalize relations with you, us and the entire Arab world and everybody else, if you give up the occupation. Now you would expect Israel to grab that opportunity. Whoa, we're a minority population, and yet we could get 78% of the country, and peace, and security, and the recognition of the entire Arab world. If we give up, all right, we give up Tulkarm, we give up Jericho, we give up Hebron, for not much of a price, Gaza, we could have peace, security, and 78% of the country 30 years ago. Can you imagine if this had been resolved 30 years ago, how that might have impacted on the Middle East of today? Why didn't Israel grab that opportunity? Well, these are all kinds of questions that are hard to answer unless you understand what I call Israel's security politics. And that is that we have to look at the West Bank and Gaza, the Palestinian areas, as a resource, not as a threat, not as an occupied territory, because Israel denies it's an occupied territory, but rather as a place where you can, and it's harsh to say this, but it's true, where you can test and develop weapons for a kind of a war that I call war against the people, that is then for exporting. And I want to go back and I want to explain what that means, and then I think we'll begin to understand why Israel isn't interested in giving up the occupied territories, that resource, and why Israel gets away with it in the world. So all right, so look, I'm looking, in other words, what we were doing always was looking down at Israel and the occupation. So to answer these questions, I said to myself, what if I looked up at Israel's place in the world? And if you look up, all of a sudden a whole different kind of a picture begins to emerge of this little country called Israel, a country the size of Connecticut. And Israel, it turns out, becomes a major arms and security power in the world. So what you can do, this is only a partial map, what you can do is explain Israel's relations to virtually every single country in the world, including countries it does not have diplomatic relations with. And there's technologies, but especially police technologies, what I call technologies of repression, surveillance systems, different kinds of security systems. It isn't only military. And you look at the map, and we're used to thinking of Israel as a client state of the U.S. And certainly there's a lot of relationships, and you love Israel, you Americans. I mean, Israel's your best ally in the Middle East, and we share values. And every 2 weeks you have an Israeli prime minister addressing Congress, and Israel, Israel, Israel. Well, you look at the map, and some interesting things emerge from this security politics. Israel is not in your basket. Or how would you say, all Israel's eggs are not in the American basket, by any means. Look, turns out Israel is the number 2 arms supplier to China. Whoa. I mean, China is the arch enemy of the United States. The United States is moving the entire 6th Fleet into the South Pacific to contain China. John Bolton, one of your stellar diplomats, was in Israel a couple weeks ago. And he said, and I'm serious, he said this, if Trump ever found out how close Israel is to China, he'd be very upset. Fortunately, he's not going to find out. But, so in other words, here's Israel as the number 2 arms supplier to China after Russia, and what makes it more impressive is that Israel's not selling big, expensive equipment. Jet airplanes and ships and missiles and tanks, that would account for that volume of business. It's selling components of weapon systems, surveillance systems, so that if Israel can be the number 2 arms supplier to China with the largest army in the world, and it's only selling smaller things, it gives you the idea of how deep the penetration is of Israel into not only the military in China, but into the security services and the police and other realms. Israel, it turns out, is it depends on the year, 2, 3, 4 largest arms supplier to India. These are 2 of the largest militaries in the world. Plus, all kinds of things. Now with Bolsonaro in Brazil, Israel has agreed to send drones to the police forces, not to the army, with facial recognition systems, weaponized drones for the pacification of the favelas, and in Bolsonaro's regime, pacification of everybody, I'm sure. And you can go all over the world. Look, 25% of Israel's arms deals are with Sub-Saharan Africa. Europe, of course, is very important. Canada. The point I'm trying to make is that Israel, you can look at Israel in every single country and document exactly how it helps the elites in that country and the governments in that country repress and control their populations, including, of course, one of the most dramatic cases is Saudi Arabia. And the Khashoggi family, the journalist who was killed in Istanbul, his family is suing Israel and an Israeli security firm for selling the eavesdropping equipment to the Saudi government with which they caught the journalist. So that Israel is, Sisi in Egypt has just said last week that, how deep the Israeli involvement is in the security of Egypt. So you can go country by country. I mean, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Myanmar, there's a worldwide boycott of weaponry, a UN boycott of weapons to Myanmar, and Israel is the only country that is bypassing that boycott. Israel has 2 military bases, one off Eritrea, both in Muslim countries. One off Eritrea, but the most important one in Azerbaijan. And this is where Israel launches its rockets into space for satellites and so on. And that's significant because this is the jumping off point to Iran. You see? Now, I would even go so far as to say, and I'm being provocative and maybe overstating the case, that in many ways Israel has a greater global reach than the United States. Now, that seems crazy. The Pentagon's budget is $1 trillion a year. You have bases in 174 countries out of 193. How could that be? Well, the American presence is a military one. You've got bases all over, but they're fairly closed areas, kind of McDonald's lands. You eat McDonald's and then you fly your airplanes out somewhere. And their impact on a society is fairly shallow, fairly limited. Whereas Israel doesn't have bases. I mean, it has those 2. It doesn't have bases, but Israel works not only with your military, it works primarily with your security services, your presidential guards, your internal domestic security, homeland security, and your police forces. You see, and with your corporations. So in a way, in almost every country, the Israeli penetration deep into the security realms of a country is much deeper than that of the United States. So Israel really is a presence to be dealt with, but there's another level to all this too. I mean, this is kind of straightforward. You sell arms to governments that repress their populations. That's nothing really new. But war against the people has another meaning, and that is, I put it within the framework of global capitalism. We all live, this is sort of the map of intersectionality in a way. We all live in one capitalist system. It doesn't matter where you are, who you are, we're all within this system. It's sort of the common, I don't know if you want to say the common enemy, but it's the common situation we live in. Well, the capitalist system certainly, over the last 50 years, as neoliberalism, this predatory, unregulated neoliberalism grows, is closing down. I mean, the happy face of Ronald McDonald and Hollywood, where capitalism liked to co-opt people and bring them in, is really becoming transformed and has a much more violent and repressive nature today. Corporate control. of the global economy is much greater than it ever was. We don't have a Teddy Roosevelt anymore to bust monopolies. We've gotten to a point where governments are really working for corporations. And corporations have more resources than most governments. I mean, Jeff Bezos himself has more money than probably any other country except the United States and maybe Britain. And it's true, in the Occupy movement, we used to say we're the 99%. That's pretty much literally the case. Oxfam came out with a report last year that 1% of the world's population owns 50% of the world's resources. And of course, the control the corporations have. At the same time, in a church, how's this for a theological concept? Surplus humanity, which is a term that corporations use. 80% of the world's population lives on less than $10 a day. And they're surplus, they're superfluous, because they'll never be really educated in a meaningful way. They're not going to be skilled workers. And worst of all, they'll never be consumers. You can't buy much on $10 a day. So they're really kind of superfluous to the world's economy. And this, of course, is a picture of the global south, but the global south is more and more coming into the global north. This is from the Occupy Wall Street movement. So our kids, I mean, those of us that are of our age or a little bit younger, our kids do not have the prospects of achieving our standards of living in terms of housing, in terms of jobs, in terms of job security, so that the global south is penetrating greatly into the global north. And as that happens, there's more and more resistance on all kinds, from demonstrations to insurgencies to other things. And wars today reflect that. Wars today are resource wars. They're not wars of ideologies and armies and countries and tanks and battles. These are the areas, especially this belt around the equator, where the world's most valuable resources are found. And these happen to be some of the poorest countries in the world. So that, we're in the process of robbing the resources of these countries, turning the people into either surplus humanity or at best cheap labor, and at the same time, of course, destroying the planet. Because unregulated capitalism has that potential of it's creating climate change and everything else we know. So, in this situation then, you have what's called, there's a geographer named Derek Gregory in Canada who calls it the everywhere war. I call it a war against the people, or you might call it a securocratic war, because the point of the war against the people is to secure the world for corporations, basically. It's securocratic in the sense of securing, on the one hand, you're securing people against an uprising, and securing going the other way means you're pacifying populations. You're pacifying populations so that they can't resist. That's securitization. So these are securocratic wars in battle space. The militaries today reflect this, their language. You've heard this all the time. Police are today referred to as warriors. Just like soldiers are considered warriors. You don't have soldiers and police so much anymore. You've got these common terms. And battle space is a term that's used more and more, both by militaries and by police forces. Because the idea is there's no more battlefields. That's an old concept. Battle space means you go wherever there's a challenge to the global system or there's a challenge to your government. It could be Brooklyn, a battle space. It could be North Dakota. It could be India, anywhere. where there's a challenge is battle space, and you have to then develop weaponry and tactics not geared to fighting a war with another country, geared to fighting the people in an everywhere war in battle space. And these are the kinds, and the basic goal is, in the end, to enforce the hegemony of the ruling classes. So, that's in a sense the context in which war against the people and Israel, I'll come back to Israel in a second, are operating. And just in case you don't get it, I mean, this is a Pentagon map of the world. I mean, the world's divided into commands. The North American command, the European command, the African command. In other words, this is the way the Pentagon, at least, sees the world. So wars are changing. These wars against the people. And it's interesting. We think of war in, Patton, World War II ways, battles and tanks and wars. Here you have a new F-35 that the Pentagon's produced for $1 trillion. But those kinds of conventional interstate wars are pretty much gone. The last major interstate war that involved two or more powers was the Korean War. And I'm not sure if China in those days was considered a major power. You might go back to World War II even. Since that time, there's been some localized wars between countries, Iran-Iraq, the Falklands War, which was a cute war, Arab-Israeli wars, Russia and Georgia, so on. But those were all, some of them were very deadly, but they were localized and didn't have that global impact. So and certainly didn't involve the kinds of weaponry that the Pentagon is producing. So these kinds of wars are pretty much gone. So what we have today are what I call securocratic wars against the people. And there are two major types. One of them is, asymmetric wars. That's a term that you probably heard. That's used fairly common. Asymmetrical warfare. Well, abroad, in the global south in particular, you've got all these kinds of wars. There's all kinds of terms for them. High-intensity operations. Many wars today are operations and not wars. Partly because Congress, or in different countries, Parliament, you have to declare a war in order for there to be a war. So that needs formal approval. But more so, if you have a war, then the laws of war obtain. And you have to fight by certain rules. You have to have prisoners of war, and they have rights, and you're limited in what you can conquer, what you can do with a conquered territory. There's all kinds of rules of war, rules of engagement. Well, if you're fighting an operation, you're free. You don't have to follow those kinds of wars. So you have Operation Desert Storm. Sometimes we call it the Gulf War, but the official title was an Operation Desert Storm. And that's why the United States could take all these people from Al-Qaeda and other groups and put them in Guantanamo or other places and call them, they called them enemy non-combatants. They invented it. There is no such thing as a non-combatant that you can hold, because you can't hold a civilian. That's a non-combatant. So they called them enemy. They try to say they're military enemies, but they're not combatants. So we don't have to follow the rules of lawfare. Those are the kinds of things you can do under operations. And of course, since terrorism is your goal now, fighting terrorism and so on, you want that flexibility. You've got limited wars, hybrid wars, small wars, irregular wars. Another nice concept that you hear coming out of Iraq was military operations other than war. See, that free you from international laws. civil wars, interstate conflicts, of course, but also and police operations. So armies today aren't fighting wars, armies are policing. So you get on the one hand military police, and you get politicized militaries. You know, counterinsurgency, of course, we hear all the time, low-intensity conflicts, dirty wars. I mean, Jeremy Scahill wrote his book about dirty wars, and all kinds of other wars like that. Those are wars against the people. They're wars against enemies, you might say. They don't have armies. They're not wars against countries. And they're wars that have mainly economic reasons. Again, Bolton, Bolton is kind of a loose cannon. And he said, if you remember, like 2 weeks ago or so, 3 weeks ago, that the reason the United States sponsored the coup in Venezuela was because of the oil. I mean, he was very upfront about it. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, and that's why we wanted to do this coup. So that, you know, underneath these kinds of operations are the corporate economic interests at play. And that's why they're wars against the people rather than governments. And then you've got asymmetrical wars at home. So you've got all of a sudden homeland security. That was never a concept in the United States. Even the concept homeland isn't a concept that was used before 9/11. So now after 9/11, you have homeland security. And, you know, it's interesting that the Patriot Act was enacted like within a month of 9/11. You know, so it was in the drawer. So these were all kinds of ways through homeland security that you can begin to inaugurate what we call a security state. A state in which security dominates all other aspects of life. And the Patriot Act paved the way for something like that. And there you have counterterrorism. And think of the metaphors. War on crime, war on drugs, war on immigration. I mean, these are kinds of, the terms that are used of wars. And you get states of permanent emergency. The United States has been in a state of emergency since 9/11. People don't always know that, but it's true. And the police and law enforcement officials have authority now that they never had, that the Americans would not have agreed to before 9/11. France is in a state of permanent emergency. And it's a permanent emergency until they actually amend their constitution to give more power to the Ministry of Security and to the policing. So that this is all a part of it, down to actual policing, militarized policing. I mean, we're all aware of the militarized police in the United States. And of course, the whole prison industry as well. So these are the forms of non-conventional war in global battle space that are fought against the people. Okay. In this kind of a system then, now we come back to this map, Israel plays a particular role. I'm not saying it's the only player by any means. I mean, a lot of other countries know how to repress populations and have technologies of repression and police that are repressive. Israel didn't invent the LAPD, you know. But as I'm saying, in this war against the people, Israel is particularly well placed as kind of a go-to state because it's been fighting a war against the Palestinian people for the last 125 years. The United States has been busy defending itself against Russia or against the Soviet Union. Europe hasn't fought colonial wars for 70, 80 years now. So the only really major industrial country with sophisticated armaments that is geared towards fighting wars against the people, that has the proper weapons, the proper tactics, the proper structures, I'll talk about that in a minute, is Israel. And so Israel has become this kind of the go-to country for countries all over the world, And and this is what I'm trying to say, as the enforcer of global capitalism to some degree. A key tenet of Zionism was always link your wagon to the biggest powers. You know, Theodor Herzl began with the German Kaiser. He tried to get the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire involved. After World War I, of course, Zionism linked itself to Britain, the Balfour Declaration and all of that. After 1948, it linked itself to France. France is the country that helped Israel develop its nuclear capability. And remember, Israel attacked Egypt together with France and England. After 1967, it became the United States. But that might not be the end of the story, because as the United States starts to decline, Israel could easily jump ship to China. In other words, Israel's eggs are in many different baskets. So, you know, and then you begin to understand how Israel gets away with it. This is what I call security politics. How you parlay your military security prowess into political clout. And without the occupation, without the ability to develop these weapons in this kind of a laboratory, you know, Israel would be New Zealand. It'd be some little country, it'd be nice to visit. It certainly wouldn't be the fourth largest nuclear power in the world. It wouldn't be in the neighborhood of NATO. It wouldn't be a military ally of the United States. But it's so the other question, why didn't Israel give up the occupation? I truly believe is partly because it's such a valuable resource. Not only economically, and we have to understand that high tech, all that it comes out of the military. That's the basis of the Israeli economy. But beyond that, it buys you political clout. So Israel's able to sit at the table with the big boys because of its military political clout. And it believes then, you know, because it has its own bottom line, Israel. It wants to keep the occupied territories. It wants to keep the whole country. So Israel believes that by making itself so valuable to the powers of the world that in the end they might criticize the occupation, but they'll never sanction Israel. And as long as Israel isn't sanctioned, it doesn't care. So you can have the Security Council vote against settlements. Remember, at the last days of the Obama administration, where the United States abstained for the first time, and it passed, but it passed without any sanctions. See, that was the trick. So Israel says, fine, we don't care about that. As a matter of fact, it's even good if you criticize us, because it makes it look like we're the victims and we're being attacked, and it actually helps our PR to be attacked by the UN, because we're more popular than the UN is. But at the same time, that security politics explains Israel's role in the world. Now, in addition to that, and this is what I try to get into in my book, Israel provides a very useful window into this whole world of the military, security, policing, global capitalism, pacification, all these sorts of things. And one reason why I wrote the book is because this is not on the agenda of the left. I mean, I wrote a book, to tell you the truth, I wrote a book about something I know nothing about. I couldn't tell you a grenade from a tank. You know, I'm not interested in it, it's not my field. But I discovered, first of all, living in Israel, having these questions, I sort of had to begin to follow the threads out. So I began to see that I'm missing something kind of significant here. But beyond that, I discovered that if you take the military and internal security and policing as one unit, one package, which it is today, globally, it's a $2.5 trillion a year industry. And I'm saying to myself, I don't know, I want to change the world, make it a better place. and I don't know anything about a $2.5 trillion a year industry, that's kind of a big blind spot. In addition to that, not knowing weapon systems, not knowing technologies is very dangerous. Most of